So one of the first things you'll find when you look into vertical farming spaces is the lack of experienced or specialized talent. A lot of people sort of come in from backgrounds that are not directly involved in CEA, but are sort of adjacent to them. So as a professor at McGill, who teaches courses like environmental engineering, could you share maybe your overall outlook on the talent issue within the industry and maybe like some points of hope as well?
Well, that's a good question. Well, so if you look at it from CEA, so controlled environment agriculture probably had three feeder directions. So there was the world of let's start off top end to the bottom end. And so the top end is probably NASA type research. So the idea that you have to have full environmental control. You could also say like Navy subs kind of fall into the same category. So either you're deep underwater or you're up in space, and you have to be able to control for all these factors. So be able to control light, temperature, humidity, etc. Work your way through the whole system. And so NASA funded a fair bit of this. The Air Force has done a little bit on that. They've kind of stopped lately, but they were some of the early one. And then the Navy did it, obviously, as part of the submarines, because people would spend months down in those locations. And then through those operations, we ended up with a few random selection places where you'd try to grow food in very remote locations, like bottom of this Antarctica or other possible places. So it was a very, very select group of people that wanted to get into it because of that. So you'd have the NASA side. Then there was the cannabis world, and predominantly that was the black market suppliers. So those were self-taught individuals. They'd take some things from the NASA perspective, but it was rare that they would be trained in that. There was a few cases of it, but I'd say it was usually more they read whatever they could. And if you went to the hydroponics world or hydroponics store, you'd usually find those individuals, and a few NASA people would be that kind of was that way until about 10 years ago. And then the third kind of industry would be the ones who were doing greenhouse. So that'd be the agricultural engineers or the plant scientists, horticulturists, were the three training vectors out of that. So one's high end, considered the top end NASA kind of research on that, with a few other smatterings on that. Then there was the bottom end, and I'm not meaning bottom as in people wise, just the industry as such didn't have training because they weren't allowed to. So it was a very much hands-on approach, learning it on the fly kind of thing. And then there was the two groups, usually at an ag university, with an agricultural engineering bent or a horticultural bent. And the two sometimes interact with each other. The difficulty that happened over the last 30 years, agricultural engineering and even horticulture have been decimated from a training perspective, and nobody really wanted to go into those. And so in the horticultural world or plant science world, they became focused on genetics and only genetics, so not production methodologies. Ag engineers predominantly design tractor design, but we'd done things before that. But that's kind of what held us together, was tractor and vehicle design. And it's been in the last 10 years that it started to come out, that we moved past that, so that we're actually trying to expand more into the greenhouse, further designs, a more controlled environment, remote sensing, etc. We walk our way through. And the challenges is that when I meant decimated, quite almost most land grant universities in the States or agricultural campuses in Canada had an agricultural engineering component, and almost all of them shut the programs down. Started in the late 70s and walked all the way up until just a couple of years ago was the last couple of ones that were shut down. And now that we're seeing enrollments go back up and people actually care about these things, we're having to try to steal them from elsewhere. So then we end up taking from the engineering perspective, we take mechanical engineers, civil or electrical engineers or chemical engineers to fill those voids. And we find that they're still lacking. They don't have an understanding of a lot of these flexibility out of the systems. And so it still is a huge issue. Same things happening on the plant science or the horticulture side, where most people ended up going into the genetics. So their understanding of growing plants is actually quite poor. They know what the genes are inside these things, but I won't say that they actually have a good understanding of how to grow this. There's obviously exceptions in all of these cases. And so we're finding that a lot of places are trying to rebuild these operations. So in the United States, there's been a big push within the ag engineering programs, but also the horticultural programs, to try to merge, not to make them the same, but actually have like a bridge person in between. So a professor that is in charge of these controlled environments. And so I've been seeing a lot of universities building this up. So originally it was a few. So here in Canada, it was basically Guelph was it. Then I came here to McGill, so we have 2 for all intents and purposes now. So we've doubled. So congrats to us. But we used to have Laval, which was exceedingly strong, and it's kind of dropped off almost to 0. But now they're making an effort to try to start bringing these trainings back in and start trading these up. Down in the States, you could go through the really big universities that had that were Purdue, Rutgers, Arizona, Michigan State, probably missing a couple more community colleges are starting to do larger trainings on these. So there is an effort underway. I will not say that we're overly good at it yet, but it takes years for this to build up to the point. But with all these additions, like out of my lab alone, I've graduated. I'm over 50 graduate students that have graduate masters and PhDs. And if you take the undergraduates, there will be hundreds that will claim that they have this expertise because they've either worked with me or worked in my lab or did design projects on these things. So we are starting to bridge that. It's just we're going from where NASA needed 10 to now needing hundreds of thousands, and we just don't have that number of people. And then we run into cases where there's people who go, well, I'm an expert in it because I have grown plants inside of my house. And it's not quite the same thing, commercial at scale. And it's the same issue that underground growers had also in the black market, is that they would grow 6 to maybe 30 plants in their basement. And some of these companies like Aurora or Canopy or Hexo, whoever you want to go with, they're growing hundreds of thousands of plants. And so you can't use the same techniques as you did when you were managing 30. So it's building. It's just going to take a while.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I appreciate those insights. Definitely seems like it's more of a supply side problem than a demand. Just sort of as a quick follow up, have you had any sort of issue with any of your students who graduated, maybe struggling to find employment or anything like that directly into the field, or which right away, like people were clamoring to be able to get access to them?
I will say that I've had 2 students come to me and say they couldn't find a job out of the hundreds, maybe 1,000 or so that we've had through our program. I thought it was amusing. I said, contact anybody you can. They said, well, couldn't find anybody. I contact 3 of my contacts, let's say 5 of my contacts. 4 out of the 5 said they're wanting to hire somebody in the next month. So demand is there. It's just, I don't think those individuals looked very hard or didn't know where to look.
Fair enough.
Quick follow-up question on that. What do you think led to this drop that you're mentioning recently in the last 10 years? Because surprisingly, in the last 10 years, we're seeing, a huge spike in controlled environment agriculture, taking over.
It was a few things. There was a short-sightedness of upper administration. They thought genetics was going to solve the world, was one. Mm-hmm. 2, for some reason in the mid 80s to 90s, agriculture became almost a derogatory term. You're trying to describe how the world was being destroyed. And I blame it on the people who were pushing climate change narratives. Basically said agriculture, cows, and beef are destroying the planet. And you can group it however you want. And you can narrow it down or not. But it basically said that we'd have students come in and says, when I first got hired at McGill, I would teach about like a pig barn, and people would say, I don't want to learn about pig barns because they're destroying the planet. I'm like, sure, except when you go eat ribs and then you have to have pig, or bacon or whatever it is you want to eat. And they go, well, I don't eat those things. Okay, great. What do you eat? Then they'd list all their things. And I'm like, well, then you need to know, like, if you're only going to be a vegan, great. How do you process soybean? Like that's a plant processing facility. And they're like, no, that's industrial agriculture. I'm like, okay, there's not a tofu facility out there that doesn't use industrial scale processing. I'm sorry. Like, if you can be as vegan as you want, and it's almost impossible to make a full food stock unless you're going to go mass production. You just can't make money on it. It's too cheap. So, and these people just didn't understand. And now that we're starting to see the narrative spun that goes, well, we're not going to try to, war in Ukraine has been quite good for agriculture, to be perfectly honest. Not good for the rest of the world, but from an agricultural perspective, we understand that if we're killing off people and not allowing food to flow for places that are generating it to places where they're needed, people starve. Like, it's not shocking. Like, as soon as the war in Ukraine started, I'm like, the biggest consequence is parts of Africa are going to starve to death. Like, they're dependent on that food. And having the mechanisms to stop that just caused so much turmoil. So now people are aware that food is a serious issue and we have to take it seriously. So agriculture has moved back up through the rankings. But for the longest time, I'd almost describe it as a 4-letter word. If you said you were in farming, that you'd get spit on and say, well, you're destroying the planet. Like, well, not so much. I'm trying to keep us alive. So it's a shift of mindsets and a shift of perspective. And now students see that there's a reason to go into this. Like students would come into my program, so bioresource engineering at McGill, and say, I want to go into soil and water because we're about to run out of water. My standard argument is, we're not going to run out of water. We're going to run out of water that you can drink. So you have to figure out how to treat the water and how to manage it. That's a different issue than running out of it. But we could run out of food. Like you see what a famine is, that's running out of food. And they never thought that was going to be a serious issue. But now we're running into those places where people can see this possibility. We don't have the buffer we used to have. Well, the big thing was 30 years ago, we had plenty of food. You could get anything you wanted all the time. So why did you care about food?
Awesome. Appreciate that a lot. Lots of really cool tidbits in there I'd love to get into. Probably will be touching on the genetically modified stuff a little bit later. But moving on to our second question. This is around capital expenditures involved with vertical farming, particularly in an urban setting, and particularly the cost of land acquisition of a site location. So oftentimes you'll see that firms that are starting out will have this sort of tension of wanting to grow in an urban area and being able to have access to the consumers at that point, but also having to deal with the prices involved with doing such a thing. And oftentimes, this has led to companies developing new and exciting business models. In particular, I'm thinking of freight farms, which began or did the whole shipping container conversion and having the modular conversion or modular farm thing going. How do you think about the trade-off between acquiring expensive urban real estate and the rewards that might have versus developing a more nimble, outside of the box operation?
Okay, well, if we backtrack out, so traditional agriculture usually grows on large tracts of land, either horticultural or cash crops or non-cash crops. So like wheat, barley, those require large acreages, and your profit margin is exceedingly tight. You're sitting at, let's say, on average 2 to 3% profit margin on these things. This year being a bit of an exception, but we'll ignore this year. If you look at it from a horticultural, a little bit higher profit margins. I won't say a lot more, 5%. Rare they'll ever get up to 10% profit margins. And so land typically has to remain quite low. The problem is land prices have been creeping up steadily for the last few years. A lot of the billionaire investors have been buying up huge tracts of land, which has been slowly pushing these prices up.
Bill Gates.
And so, yeah. And so then you end up having to tie in, how do we do these productions? And so then the challenge with urban agriculture is it becomes a trade-off of what can you afford and how close can you get to the city? And so the horticultural people who are land-based people would be as close as they could without having to pay crazy amounts of money. So a standard, let's just do a theoretical number, but it's fairly close to true. So 160 acres could sell for about $1 million across most of Canada. If you're going to buy, let's say, a 10-acre lot now, 10-acre lot in urban centers, not even downtown, just urban type centers, you're paying for 10 acres, you're paying well over $1 million a lot for those kind of things. Typically, they stick houses on it. If it's zone agricultural or light industrial, which is what usually ends up happening, then the price obviously gets pushed down. And then if you're going into urban centers, those ones go into 10, 20, 30, maybe even 100 million, depending on what your location is out of these things. The problem is your productivity remains roughly the same if you're doing land straight up on this. So if your profit margin is 3%, you're never going to pay it off. Even the $1 million for 160 acres, you can't pay off. You're going to be in debt forever. So then they're like, okay, so how am I going to shift that profit margin? And so having higher densities of plants or having a longer growing season. So you put a greenhouse over top of it. Now you've extended it from just one growing season or possibly two, depending on how the local weather is on that. And now you can do 3, 4, possibly as high as depending on your crop. So if it's leafy greens, you could get up to 12 crops under it. Inside of a greenhouse, or tomatoes, you do 2, let's say. And so now you've increased your profit margin significantly by doing this. If you're going into urban centers, now the problem is the price of land that I said was 10-fold higher. So you need to somehow get your profit margin even higher still. And so you need to have either higher rotation or higher density. And so that's where the vertical farming becomes beneficial, because you can have multiple tiers out of it, and you can pack the plants in a lot higher. So you've gone from multiple cropping cycles, greenhouse, to multiple tiers, vertical farming. And if you can do both simultaneously, now you've increased it. Problem is you're limited by what crops you can grow and the distance that can be transported. And so it becomes this trade-off of the economics between what you can afford versus what you think your profit's going to be and how quickly you can turn over. So if you're going to try to grow, let's say, palm trees, not that I recommend palm trees by any stretch, they take a long time to grow, 10 years minimum before they get up to any size. So, and having zero profit for 10 years in a high density location makes zero sense. Or you could choose apples also if you want to make it so it's something a little bit more, but you're not going to get a crop for the first 3 to 4 years. So you're trying to scale it up to a higher thing. If you're going to be growing leafy greens, if I planned it right now, theoretically, depending on the crop that I'm growing and how much I want to push it, 28 days later, I can get product out the door. If you're going to do tomato, 55 days. So you can see the profit on these things as you push themselves along. So we're looking for that profit balance. And then if I'm going to transport wheat, theoretically, I can transport anywhere within the world really quickly. So if I need to move wheat from ignoring the war, but Ukraine would ship from Ukraine through all of Africa, possibly elsewhere, but that was their primary location. Here in Canada, we ship a lot to Asia. And so that, but if I'm going to be shipping leafy greens, they only have a short shelf life, 14 days, let's say, give or take, before you want them sold. So shipping them from California, you're losing almost a week just by doing that shipping. So you got a 7-day window that you can sell them here on the shelf. And so having it locally produced means that I get a window longer to sell. So I can take a little bit more of a hit on price or yield or cost, whichever one I want to take it on, or a mixture of all three. And then I gain because I know that I could probably sell all of my product. I'm going to have very limited amount of losses, as opposed to California, which quite often, I won't say 50%, but they'll creep into that 20, they're just transporting the stuff. So that becomes the balancing game. So how do I play with those factors and figure out where I can stick things? So if I'm sticking in downtown city, I need a high throughput crop that has a high profit margin that I can pack in very high density, and then I can afford these things.
And I think that kind of brings me to a kind of follow-up question I wanted to have under this bucket, which is the question of processing. You mentioned like something like wheat, which we can't grow right in CEA yet, which does require a lot of processing, versus something like a leafy green, which does require processing, but not to as much as a degree. How would you say, or kind of where does the processing question fit into that balance of like, do I want to do processing in-house? Do I want to ship it out somewhere? How does that fit in there?
So wheat we can grow indoors. NASA showed that a bunch where we can actually grow wheat indoors. But this will answer your question, which is the problem is a typical combine, which we use for thrashing the grain out of the heads, are not cheap devices. You could probably get a really cheap used one for maybe $15,000, but it's not going to be able to do a lot. Most of the new ones are creeping into $500,000 to $1 million. So, and they're running a lot of grain through that to even make that economical. So if you're going to be running, let's say, a container base, so 40 feet by 10 feet, and do it as a single tier, that you're getting, we measure them in bushels in at least my part of the world, or you can measure them in tons, but you're not going to get more than a couple bushels per one of those containers. And we sell those for $5. So a growth cycle of wheat in a container, $5 per cycle. Let's say you get lucky and you can figure out how to do it 4 times. That means you're making maybe $100 to $200 off the wheat. So not going to be cost effective. That's literally, sorry, let's backtrack on that. That wasn't $100 of profit. That's $100 that you're selling it for.
Yeah.
You might be able to get a higher premium, but you're not into the hundreds of thousands. You're in the best 10,000, even if you could get the top end premium for that. And so the cost of that piece of machinery is just so high that you can't afford it. So you have to choose crops. So if you choose tomato, literally going in there and picking it by hand. The owner is the person who's doing all the processing of that. They can physically wash it, they can package it, everything else. If you're doing leafy greens, you can also do it by hand, a little bit more challenging than the tomato is, but it also has a shorter shelf life. A quicker throughput time. And so in the end, you can do it yourself and you can market them and sell them. Exactly. But if you're wanting to scale that, if you see what any of the microgreen companies, either vertical like Aero Farms or Plenty, which are two of the ones in the States, they have huge industrial cost expenditures on that. So they have a washing station that then does mass cooling on it, and they're drying it, and then they're mixing them as they want, and then they put them into the packages. And so they're paying millions of dollars for those processing facilities over and above everything else, just so that they can do that processing. So we typically will highly recommend not choosing something that's going to take a lot of processing as a startup, just because you can't afford the cost and investment. But if you're Plenty and have just shy of $1 billion of invested money, sure, go for it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that's also very helpful. I think that'll help kind of later framing with the question I have around specialization around particular crops, because I think it's very much related to that. So we talked about capital expenditures. I want to talk a little bit about the operating expenditures now. Maybe getting a little bit more nitty gritty than we already have, which is kind of hard to imagine. So at your biomass production lab at McGill, it has many focuses, but one of them is the improvement of energy efficiency of greenhouses and other plant growth environments by looking at things like light and heating systems. Can you sort of maybe just at a high level give an overview of the different goals farms try to manage when they're considering these various system compositions, like how they relate to one another, and sort of the trade-offs that occur at that point?
Okay, fair enough. That's a kind of a rigged question, but that's all right. I'll try to work my way through it. It is what I spend a lot of my
hands
no,
up,
no,
hands up.
and it's what I spend a lot of my research time doing. So I'll backtrack out of it a little bit. So one, we have labor, we have heating. Rare we do much heating in our systems. It's almost always cooling, and then we have light. So we have cooling, heating, and light. And that's it. Those are our three primary operational expenses by far. So we have the benefit here in Quebec is that we probably have one of the lowest electrical costs possible on the planet. We could get lower through heavy subsidization, but we get exceedingly low cost. And the Quebec government likes not subsidize, putting the electricity into these kind of industries so that it's a value-added product. Employs local people, plus we can ship these things. So we have that huge advantage. Plus it's one of the lowest carbon sources that we have too. So we have an advantage over almost everybody else just from that. Our problem is our labor costs are quite high, not as high as other parts. So if you're in New York City, obviously they'll charge a lot more. Los Angeles are a hell of a lot more also for that. And so how do we minimize labor costs? So automate things, but then that becomes a trade-off. If the owner's doing it, does he want to invest $100,000 of some kind of processing? I do a little bit of work in that area, trying to design machines that can help these things, or at least process them in a quicker form. But then the two big ones that are kind of left after we say, okay, labor we can't play with too much, especially if it's just an owner operator kind of system, is we got the light and the cooling system. So how does HVAC? So I'll do HVAC first. How do we try to cool down the space without having a huge centralized air conditioning unit, and also control the humidity inside of that so you're dehumidifying simultaneously? We're working with a few companies on this. Typically what they do is they like taking huge HVAC units and install them in. So 14, 16, 20, 100-ton units, like huge units, which you'd be using designed for swimming pools to dehumidify the air around a swimming pool. Problem is plants produce more moisture than a swimming pool does. So then you need these huge systems. Challenge is we don't use them all the time. We only use them at the end of the life. So just as we're about to harvest is the biggest peak. And so how do we try to share resources between either locations or systems simultaneously? A lot of systems or operating companies realize that the best way to do is intercropping. So you'll start one crop today, another crop in 3 days, another crop in 3 days. And so you're always peaking and keeping the loads fairly uniform inside the system. And that works. The problem is that if you ever get a disease response or disease infection into it, now you lose the whole crop. And so better is to have 3 rooms and then stagger them. Do 1 room complete, harvest, clean, second room, harvest, clean, and move on to these things. But then getting the HVAC system to bridge across all of those ones. So those are fairly large challenges. I'd say if you look at the price cost of just the energy, it's almost 40-40. So 40% light, 40% HVAC out of it. And then pumps and other things we say is 20%, which is probably a bit of a lie. It's a little lower than that, but it's not a bad estimate to start off with. on that. And then we have the lighting system. And so one of the earlier questions was, why did this come about? And it was because LEDs came into existence and they're cheap. You can now buy some LED individuals for less than a cent. So 0.001 cents is what I see some of them being sold for. So they're really, really cheap. We still have to build the circuit and the chips and the arrays and everything else. But when your starting point is so cheap, then you can start building this up. They're exceedingly high light intensity. You can see one over my shoulder here, and that's not a good one. If you see the tower part there, if it turns itself on, it's going to bright up the whole room. And so and that's just a 110 power supply, the equivalent of about a 100-watt system. So it's crazy amount of light that we get. And then the other thing was, if we did the same thing with HPS, which was one of the best light emitting systems out there, the temperature of it was crazy hot. You touch it, you burn yourself. Plant touches it, it gets burned. LEDs now, those ones up and touch, like fingers, everything, no chance of burning. So now we've dropped the heat load from the lights. We have higher light intensities, so the efficacy has gone up quite significantly. And so this allows us to start to push into these places that we have it. And that happened about 10 years ago. So indoor agriculture was always a significant player, but once LEDs became cost effective, low energy and low temperature, now we could start sticking them anywhere we want. And so that's kind of taken this industry and pushed it on. And so I spent a lot of time on the lighting, but I'm pushing into the HVAC system, and then automation is the next big one to try to reduce the labor consideration. All three factors are core requirements for this industry to grow, but we still got a bit. LEDs are getting close. They're the closest to what would be considered a finished product, but we probably still have about 10, 20 years before we max out on their capacity.
That actually brings me perfectly into my next question, which kind of deals with crop variety. I think you kind of alluded to the fact that it's sort of a question of like, how much energy do you have to put into a system in order to get X amount of biomass, right? And so with other crops, you have to put in a huge amount of energy, and you only get smaller amounts of biomass. And that has been alleviated by the fact that LEDs have become much more efficient, and don't heat up as much, things like that. This question is more so around, and I guess kind of already previewed your answer, is how do you feel about the hopefulness of LEDs taking us forward? You said about 10 to 20 years. If you could go into a little bit more why you think that is, that'd be great. And also the question of specialization. In particular, I'm thinking of the firm Oishi, based out of New Jersey, that grows just strawberries, the Omakaza, I think, variety. Is the answer to just almost like focus your business model on a particular type of crop, which is sort of at like the cutting edge of what you're able to accomplish, or is it something else? Yeah.
So the value, okay, so I'm going to try to answer the questions in backwards order. So should we be focusing on individual crops? There's a value to that, because anytime you talk to somebody who's a really good grower, it took them 3 years to gain the knowledge base to know how to grow that individual crop. If you're growing 100 different crops, you won't be good at any of them. I'm sorry. You'll be maybe functional at best, but you're not going to be superior. And if you want to be a top player in it, then you have to be able to focus on that. So you can do class types. So if you want to grow leafy greens, focus on that. Or you want to do head lettuce, you can focus on that. But there's a lot of different kinds of heads and a lot of different kinds of leafy greens. If you want to do fruits, vine fruits, then you can do cucumbers and you can do tomatoes, and you could probably focus on those two, or maybe add bell peppers into that if you want to do fruits. Fair enough, you can do that, but I wouldn't try to cross link between those ones. So you want to try to, because there is enough similarity between some of them that you gain on that. But if you're doing leafy greens, a tomato, and a strawberry, those are different games, and that's hard to understand. You got to look at this as being like children, or like people. And there's certain ticks they have, and you have to start to learn what those ticks are, or what they want and what they don't want. So those are challenges. Back to trying to tailor. So one of the big pushes in our lab, and people have been trying to do this, is how do we tailor the lights? So going back to the light system, tailor the lights or the environment specifically for those. We find in a case like lettuce and tomato, they're fairly close to each other. We know that there's differences. We've seen that through a lot of our tests, but we can actually tailor some of these wavelengths of light. So right now that's a broad spectrum light white that you see over the shoulder there, but if it was kind of a more of a purple hue, then it would be a red-blue mixture, or you can do straight blues or straight reds or whatever you want as mixtures. And so they call that light recipes that have to be developed. That's a huge industry unto it. So I figure those out and becomes grower preference or whatever your end product is. If you want just pure biomass generation, then I like the pure white, works brilliantly. Amber is my absolute favorite, but that's a different argument. And then if you do different flavor profiles or different colors, you can do that also. So how do we play with the reds or the greens to try to get different, or even the UVs and the far reds to get different concentrations of secondary compounds. So in the case of cannabis, how do we push out THC or the terpenes? In the case of lettuce, do we want to have high anthocyanin and more of a purple coloration, or do you want it more as a dark green or a light green, and all these things? And then back to the LED component, using LEDs is kind of the following. It's been following Moore's law, which is the idea that, what is it, every year and a half we double computer chip power and reduce its size by half kind of mentality. So we're following this exponential curve. It still seems to be holding true. LEDs are following a similar one. I forget what the name is for that one, but same idea. But there's an upper limit to what we know LEDs have the capacity to do. So putting in 1 watt of energy, passing half a watt of light coming out. So we're almost 50% efficacy, as we say, 46, 40, some over 50. We think the upper bounds is the 60 some range, 68. I think somebody said 68.2. Not that kind of a researcher, so I won't say with certainty that that's what it is, but there's an upper bound. And so once we get to that point, then we don't think we can go much higher. There might be newer technologies that allow us to push a little bit higher past that, but we're not going to get to 100%. There's always going to be some heat and some losses along the way. And so even if we went to 100%, that's still, there's so much technology that's needed to do that. So we're still not gaining. So going to 50% or 75 is only a 25%, well, 50% jump, depending on how you want to calculate it. But then going from 75 to 100 is not as big a jump again. So we're losing that increase rate. And so is it worth it to spend $1 billion to gain that last few percentage? But we're getting to the point now, in the end, we're not there yet. That's what I'm saying, about 20 more years. But we are getting to that point. If we follow the curve, it's been following fairly close to it. And at some point here in the near future, we'll be maximized. And that will be in the blues, the whites, and the reds. But then we have to figure out, can we do the greens? Can we do the far reds, the UVs, etc.? And then we'll bring all those ones in online also. So we're getting to that point.
Awesome. Jamil, is there anything that you want to say? I know kind of going back and forth. Okay.
I think the conversation is flowing very well. No.
Perfect. So one last question on sort of operating stuff, and then we can get into the fun underground stuff, which is why we're here. So, we talked about crop selection, and we talked about the limitations of LED, where we think LEDs are headed. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to ask this question. I don't think it's going to contribute too much to the conversation. Well, we can go straight into the underground stuff. Cool. So, Jamil, here's where I would love for you to be a little bit more involved, if you can be, just anywhere you feel like you want to add context or anything like that. Feel free to jump in. So I think during the first half of our conversation, we touched upon very important kind of takeaways, where maybe not necessarily the vertical farming space could improve, but more so where there's areas for growth. So I'd love to discuss, in the context of underground farming, first this question of operating expenditures, and in particular energy expenditures due to lighting and HVAC. So at this point, we've kind of tried to pride ourselves in the expected energy savings we believe that we'll have by going underground. Recently, we did some work with Maya. Is it Maya Engineering? Is that the official title, Jamil?
My heat transfer.
My heat transfer.
CFD simulations.
Yep. And actually, Jamil had an interview with engineering.com where they kind of discussed the results of the simulation and talked a little bit about underground farming. Can you maybe talk a little bit about how much of an advantage it would be to even have something like 20% energy savings within operations?
Okay, so back to the original discussion about the profit margins, that's tight, 3%. Let's say on average. Some of the vertical farming maybe is a little bit higher than that. But if you could cut 20% out of your heating cost or your lighting cost, which is about 40% of your total energy usage, which let's say is about 20% of your total cost, gaining 1 to 2 total points means that you went from a 3% profit margin to a 5% profit margin, which is the difference between being functional, profitable, or very profitable. And so if you can cut those out, that becomes that shift that we're at. And we're on the fine line. Like, it depends on the crop, that depends on the market that you're in, but you're on that fine line. You might be just barely profitable. Cutting 1 or 2% out now makes you very profitable. And so that's why that market of 3% improvement is huge for a lot of these players. Yes, the price might get pushed down, but if you're first to market in that, you get to hold on to that profit for X number of years until everybody else catches up to you. And if you're lucky, well, this is big luck. Some other companies might go bankrupt because they don't know how to do it, and then you get to take that market share away from them too. So there's two advantages of it. And it's one of my arguments on why people should be doing research. You don't have to do it at the university, but at least in-house, is because you're trying to gain those small incremental improvements, which puts you past that profit margin scale, but also allows you to compete and hold on for a better resilient company that can handle market fluctuations. California, let's say, is a big rainfall event. Lettuce gets dumped on the market. You need to be able to handle that. And if you're profitable at 5% as opposed to 2%, at 2%, it doesn't take much to knock you down. But at 5%, you got a little bit of a buffer. 10%, obviously better. So testing these things and figuring out how to push those things forward are always advantageous.
Yeah, I think I actually forgot to talk about this question on maintenance, but I think it's a good time to bring it up as ever. There's been discussions around maintenance involved in vertical farming, and there's been firms who've had struggled with those issues, being maybe overly dependent on the technology, if there's issues with power, not necessarily being able to maintain their systems, clean their systems. There's also the question of pollination. There's firms like, I think I wrote down their name down here, Polybee, which uses drones to pollinate, or I don't know if it's pronounced I think it's pronounced Edite, which is like an Israeli company that uses lasers to pollinate. So there's all these like almost like little finite things you need to do. You need to be able to get in there and almost like touch your crops to be able to manipulate your systems. With something like GreenForges, where it's almost secluded, far away, what are maybe some of the challenges that you see there? And Jamel, I'd love for you to kind of use this moment to maybe talk about how some of the ways that we are trying to overcome those challenges.
Could you just clarify the question a bit more, like how GreenForges is addressing maintainability issues?
Yeah, exactly. So first, like for Mark, if you could talk maybe a little bit about like the big things that you see in issues of maintainability, whether it's pollination, cleaning, anything like that. And then Jamil, if you could maybe talk about how we address those things.
Cool.
Right. So the first one is you have to be able to monitor, and not just sensors that you have in the system, but that's advantageous, but also having. So I have two little props here. So this is a little airspeed sensor, basically a bulb sensor. So you can see a little, let's pull it up here. See that? It's a hot wire anemometer, so it can measure wind speed, but also measure temperature. And so you want to maintain, if you're doing leafy greens, you want to be over about 1 meter per second, or at least around that range, so that you can reduce your tip burn considerations. And we find that over time, filters, fans get old and they don't work quite as well. So going around and testing periodically is advantageous. This is a second device. I'm not recommending by any. Ooh, you get to see my light turn on now. So that's when the secondary lights kick in. So we're good on that one. And so light sensors are useful because even though I won't say this is a top end one by any stretch, it gives me a rough idea of what's happening. And you don't have to use these two by any stretch, but going around and doing testing and confirming that systems are working. Filters will get plugged and people sometimes forget to change them. Lights like that one over there will actually start getting old and will start to decrease in its intensity. Human eye will still say it's really bright, and it is bright. but it's not bright enough for the plant. So going around and taking sensors and checking this, checking relative humidity, checking temperature, all of these things should be done, CO2 levels, etc., just to confirm these things. So it's almost part of your procedure of maintenance going in. Are these things all working properly? Do I need to change? If it's a filter system, am I following it properly? But even just having a look at it and going, is it being plugged? Or having a sensor that measures the pressure differential across them so you know if it's becoming plugged. If you're getting into the other systems like pollination systems, some growers want to do it themselves. They want to be out there and touching and feeling. And there's a value to that. In some cases you can. And so is there means of remote sensing? So you can have high resolution cameras or regular web cameras that can actually collect this data. Is there a machine vision process you can go through so you can track the quality of these things? Bees, we find, are actually quite good in controlled environments. They don't get overly lost. They can go find the flowers. They can do the pollination that's needed for this. As long as you're not playing with really wacky LEDs, they function quite happily out of these things. So we can use these. Difficulty is if you allow bees, now you have to understand there'll be other insects. We have to be able to track those also. So there's an insect management system that's involved too. And we don't want to be spraying pesticides in a controlled environment if we don't have to, because ultimately that just adds another level of complexity. So most of this is trying to not be the same as field, but still understanding what those challenges are and being able to monitor and control it.
Yeah, I can comment a little bit on just pretty much adding on Mark said and how we're addressing this. On one hand, monitoring, but also maintainability, but also that level of accuracy when it comes to controlling the recipe that you want. So on the monitoring side, I mean, our software team is working very hard on setting up all kind of sensors that will monitor, temperature, pressure, water flow, any restrictions in terms of the filtration, any changes in humidity, temperature around the casing. So one big aspect that we think, at least the first iterations of the underground pilots, will be monitoring underground temperature at different times, because data literature is not sufficient at the moment to get very accurate results on how climatization underground is going to work. So we're going to be focusing on a lot of monitoring when it comes to kind of casing temperature, but obviously also plant development, growth, humidity generation, temperature variations. So all this is being set up now and being addressed with the software team very well, very tightly tested in Andrew's lab now, where we have the setup being connected through different like PLCs, Raspberry Pis, and then you have the software team reporting on the data continuously. So that's being tested. We also have on the hardware side maintainability. So let's say something wrong happens. We're designing most of our systems from the ground up, which gives us the flexibility of accounting for maintainability and for operations very quickly at an early stage. So, for example, the way we're designing the lights in underground now is just we're making it super easy to extract in case. I mean, I wouldn't say as easy as a Formula One car replacing tires, but we're taking into account that in case of any LED issues, we're making sure that it's something that anybody can come in, pull these LED rings up, do any kind of replacement, and put it back without any massive interruption to the rest of the system. We're doing the same thing with the pumps. We're doing the same thing with the ducting. So as we're designing this from the ground up, we're taking into consideration, okay, what is the reliability, maintainability, and the availability of the system? These are different measures you can take into account to make sure your system is, back to the operational cost, is just minimizing these operational costs, these losses as it runs. And then lastly, the vision is kind of how can we reach to a point where ultimately you would be, because what is GreenForges trying to position itself in the market is as a technology provider, right? So what we're trying to develop with the software is that, okay, can you be able to go to a client and tell them, okay, well, we're at the point where you can look at an iPad and choose your crop recipe, what kind of flavor you want, and then all our systems will just automatically adapt continuously to get you to the recipe that you need, based on kind of all the data that we've accumulated, analyzed, and what the insights that we've gathered from the market. So that's in terms of future vision, where we see that kind of data side of things happening, and maintainability, I guess, is part of it too. Hope that answers it. Yeah.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was looking for. Thank you both for that. So we're running a little bit not close to overtime, but definitely not where I wanted to be at this point, which is not a bad thing. We've had some really good, interesting discussions. Um, so I'll skip a few of the things. Professor Lefsrud, I wanted to ask you. This is a bit of a silly question, um, but if you could just snap your fingers, and create your own farm in an urban setting to you just be the most effective at feeding the most people, what are some of the characteristics, some of the particular features that this farm would have? Um, Now that we've had this whole discussion about the sort of trade-offs that you have to balance when building an agriculture or a controlled environment agriculture space.
Okay, so good question. I don't think it's foolish by any stretch. I think about this a lot. So we need to be able to control all the environmental factors. So we need to be able to control the light, the temperature, the air movement, CO2, oxygen, etc. to these things. My dream world is to have an exceedingly high density plant system. So almost lighting, water supply, air movement system for each individual plant would be ideal. So you can have a little air jet that does hot and cold, water supply, light system, everything on that, and then packing them in a three-dimensional axis so that they're almost like a honeycomb matrix. So they're packed on top of each other in all kind of positions out of this, and allowing that to be harvested. Right now, I see way too much space being used between light system and plant, or too many walkways, a huge amount of walkways. I don't see the value of having so many walkways when people aren't actually needing to walk into these spaces. So why are we losing half of our space just to have people walk around through these things? So is there a way that we can do this? I'm going to give a plug to the GreenForge group, because their advantage is they don't have to walk down into their system. Nobody wants to go down there, to be perfectly honest. So they're already in a nice, dense system. It does increase challenge to control everything, but the value is that you've now figured out how to pack them in tight, and you can actually start doing them on other scales too. So if you don't have the ability to dig a hole in the ground, can we do them up in the in higher altitude, like above the ground kind of mechanism, or can we do them on the horizontal, or do them in other locations? And so I like that. And so that is my dream. So it's one reason why I like consulting and giving advice to the GreenForge team, is because I see that they're pushing that boundary, and I think that is a place that we need to be able to go. And then having the mechanisms to monitor and control that. And I won't say anyone actually has a good ability for that yet. We're learning as we go along, but can we track the light levels at every plant? Nah, not going to happen. Going to be too costly. Can we track the nutrient supply to each plant? In a dream world, the plant would say, I need this, and then we give it to them. And I'm not meaning like it's not verbally telling you this, but based on all of our AI and our data and everything we know, it's going to need more phosphorus tomorrow. So let's supply it. It's going to need a little bit more light towards the end of the day. So let's supply that. And they will start communicating through however they want to communicate to us, and we'll be hopefully smart enough that we'll understand it. At this point, we don't have that ability, but we are learning a few of these things. In my lab, we take great pride in the fact that we use the plant as a means to understand what's happening in the environment, and it's shocking how much it tells us. It can tell us whether or not the temperature dropped 2%. We can see whether or not we missed a watering cycle. And the plants tell us these things. We're just not, as growers, quite smart enough to know this. If you're a really good grower, you can kind of start to see it. But with some of these machines, all of a sudden, we had a case where we failed to water over 2 cycles, which was about 2 hours. And using our machine vision system, it told us, plant's not happy. And so my student went back out to the lab and realized that he had accidentally unplugged the watering system. If you were waiting in a normal system, that would take at least a day to 2 days to actually see that difference. But with the machine vision system, we saw it in 2 hours, which is shocking how quick you can respond to these things. So the plant was telling us, and we were smart enough at that moment to see that something was happening. But I won't say we're overly good at that, but we do get it fairly often, so we're getting better.
So Jamil, is there any things you would like to add to Mark's farm?
I think that's really interesting. I didn't know it was that advanced on the excuse me, machine learning side. So maybe that's something we can start looking into adopting to a pilot test with the GreenForge at some point. But yeah, no, super cool to hear.
Well, Mark, Jamil, I want to thank you guys so much for being so generous with your time, taking time to sit down with me. The questions today and discussion tonight, I think, were really helpful. I will be posting this blog post by the end of the week, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested. And again, thank you so much, Professor Lefsrud. It was really helpful. Yeah, really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the questions. They're all good questions, so
Yeah.
I'm happy to always respond. This is actually, if people want to ever take a class, so McGill University, we teach a fair bit of controlled environment. I'm kind of proud of that, actually. But I teach a graduate level class that we talk about almost everything you just asked there, and it's done across a whole semester.
All right. Well, if I'm ever interested in enrolling in the graduate program at McGill, I know the man to go to.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna lie. At certain times, I would catch myself. Although I know Ramon, sorry, you'd ask me sometimes to contribute to the conversation. I'm just really enjoying Mark's just narration and just take it all the way back and bring it home. So, and the way the questions were set up was awesome. So thank you.
No, it was fun. So thank you.
I'm glad you thought so, Professor. Appreciate all the help again. You guys